Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Yonit Arthur. I'm an audiologist and strength coach, and I specialize in vestibular disorders. Welcome to my channel, The Steady Coach. Today we're going to be talking about travel and neural circuit dizziness. So this is a topic I get asked about a lot on my channel, especially during the summer travel season. So let's dive into this topic. If you're suffering from neural circuit dizziness, that is symptoms of PPPD, MdDS, vestibular migraine, uncompensated neuritis, etc., you may have been told either by peers or by a physician or other healthcare provider that travel is something that you should be worried about. Some people even take the extreme position of telling you not to travel at all, whereas other people caution against traveling without making a whole bunch of preparations. Now, why would travel be something that you would want to think about in the first place if you have neural circuit dizziness? Well, many of you have probably noticed that being on moving vehicles, being in wide open spaces, and especially from my perspective, being in particularly stressful situations tend to make your symptoms worse. Now, for the first two, the explanation has to do with how your vestibular system is responding in these situations. And for the last one, we're actually talking a little bit more about the root cause from my perspective here on my channel. So with the first two, why being in a moving vehicle of some kind, in other words, engaging in passive motion, in other words, your body is being moved without you having to move it yourself. And for the second, being in wide open or crowded spaces like an airport, it's actually pretty easy to understand why these might pose some interesting challenges for people who are suffering from dizziness. As we've talked about extensively in previous videos, when you're suffering from neural circuit dizziness, what's happening is that your brain's not doing the best job of coordinating your senses that are involved in your balance system. So to remind you, there are three senses involved in your balance system: your eyes, your ears, or the vestibular organs inside your ears, and your sense of touch or proprioception. When you're moving your own body, your brain is getting a whole lot of information about what's going on around you. And usually when it has all of that information coming in, even when it's not really sure what to do with some of the sensory information coming in, it can usually make sense of what's going on. So in other words, when you're moving yourself, sometimes that makes things a little bit easier on your brain. Although that isn't true for everyone, and some of you may have specific difficulties with walking. In contrast, when you're being passively moved, you're getting kind of contradictory information from all of your senses. Your sense of touch may be telling your body that you're not moving because you're just standing still or sitting still, whereas your ears and or your eyes may be sending information to your brain that you're accelerating or decelerating, in other words, speeding up or slowing down. And again, if your brain's not at its best in terms of its ability to coordinate between all that information from the senses, sometimes having this contradictory information can bring on symptoms. And I say sometimes because there's a great number of you out there who actually feel better in passive motion than in active motion or when you're not moving at all. Why does that happen? Well, that has to do with what your brain is predicting. We've talked about this extensively in other videos, so I'm not going to go into a whole lot of depth about this, but essentially, what your brain is good at coordinating depends on what your brain is expecting. If your brain is expecting movement and you're not moving, then it gets confused. And this is what happens when people have symptoms like MdDS-type symptoms where they feel like they're moving all the time. The brain is anticipating being moving even though it's not moving. In contrast, people who have symptoms that are associated more with moving themselves, so they don't necessarily feel internal movement, but they react to movement when it comes, the brain is anticipating being still, and when it moves, it's like, whoa, what do I do with that information? So in other words, the difference in symptoms has more to do with what your brain is programmed to expect versus a difference in how these symptoms come about. And then on the other hand, we have these crowded open spaces with lots of people moving around, and that can be particularly difficult for people who are visually dominant. And again, this is something we've touched on in my channel quite a bit. I'll link to a video below where I talk about it. But basically, for people who have a vestibular disorder, your brain can over-rely on your vision. And when it does that, it can quickly be overwhelmed when there's a whole bunch of crazy, contradictory visual information coming at you, such as when you're walking through a crowded airport. So these are the two things that people fear: going into an airplane or train or other passive means of motion, or being in crowded open spaces. The third thing I mentioned was the stress of travel. This is actually the main thing that I worry about for my folks. As we've talked about also extensively on my channel, neural circuit dizziness is a disorder that's driven by your brain being in threat mode. When your brain is in threat mode, it is much more likely to make the kinds of prediction mistakes that we just talked about that lead to your brain expecting one thing even when something else is happening. When it does that, it makes you dizzy. So as far as I'm concerned, the root cause of all of these symptoms is related to the brain being in stress, threat, or danger mode, however you like to look at it. So from my perspective, putting yourself in a situation where things are going to be extra stressful, where the situation might be more likely to launch you into extensive threat mode, is actually more of a consideration than the two vestibular ones we just talked about. So all that being said, I think this explains why well-meaning medical professionals and well-meaning peers might be talking to you about avoiding travel or avoiding passive motion. And in my opinion, that recommendation, although well-meaning, is completely wrong. So I'm going to give you 3 tools today that you can use to help prepare yourself for travel and have an awesome travel experience. The very first and most important tool is education and understanding. As we talked about before, the medical community and many of your peers are looking at neural circuit dizziness as a purely biomedical problem. In other words, they're looking at the symptoms you're having as the result of some biological process in the brain. They are not taking into consideration the biopsychosocial model that, again, we've talked about extensively in other videos. And of course, the biopsychosocial model simply means that there are always biological components driving symptoms, but there are also always psychological and social components driving symptoms as well. Now, psychological doesn't mean you're making it up. What that means is that when you're under stress or when you're in threat mode, your brain is actually going to function differently from how it functions when you're not stressed out or in threat mode. So counterintuitively, by putting into your head that travel is actually something you need to worry about, something that you need to feel threatened about, something you need to make special preparations for, it actually increases threat mode in your brain, and it increases the likelihood that your brain is going to activate this neural circuit that's going to cause dizziness symptoms. So the most important component to being able to travel while you're experiencing these neural circuit dizziness problems is to understand that the neural circuit dizziness symptoms are related to your brain being in threat mode. And the more you fear or anticipate something like traveling, like going outside, the more you try to avoid those things, the more threat mode is going to build up and the more likely you are to have symptoms. Now let's take this a little bit further. So one metaphor I like to use is when you were a kid, was there ever a house in your neighborhood or in your friend's neighborhood that had a big scary dog behind a gate that would bark at you when you rode your bike by or when you walked by? So I'm assuming most of us have had this experience. When you had that happen to you once or twice and then you went down the street again, what would you do when you got next to that house? Well, maybe you would also just start to anticipate the barking before it was even there. So whether there was a dog out in the yard at that time or not, you would start to anticipate the dog barking at you by having a physical reaction, what I call physical anxiety, or that fight or flight type of response. So here's the good news. When you've been living your daily life with chronic dizziness symptoms, your brain is going to associate some of your daily routine with this barking dog. So many of you, of course, have been more limited in your ability to go do stuff. Some of you have been stuck completely at home. And after a while, your brain will start to associate the way you feel with the situation or environment you're in or the routine that you have. In other words, It's expecting the barking dog, whether it actually barks or not, and it creates that fight or flight reaction to it just in response to your daily routine. And this is where I have some awesome news for you, because in my experience, my clients who've traveled have often had a reduction in symptoms when they've been traveling. Why? The barking dog phenomenon, also known as brain associations. When you're not walking down that street where your brain is anticipating the dog, you don't have that anticipatory or expectation of the fight or flight response. So your brain isn't on alert as much. Even with the stress of travel, even with some worries about how the airplane's gonna feel and what it's gonna be like to go through a crowd, my clients have almost uniformly reported that they have felt better on vacations than they do at home. So knowing this piece of information, armed with this piece of information, your fear about your upcoming travel can now start to come down, and that is going to help your brain stay out of threat mode and not activate your dizziness symptoms while you're traveling. That said, I do have 2 additional tools that might be useful for you during your travels. The first one is connection. We have a biochemical response to threat, as we've talked about extensively. We also have a biochemical response to being safe, being seen, and being connected to other people. When we feel safe with or comforted by the people that we are with, we are much less likely to go into that threatened fight or flight type of state. So my biggest suggestion for you, if you're traveling with a partner or a friend or maybe a group of family members, is to have them watch my video on how to help a friend or loved one with chronic dizziness, which I will also link to below. If that person is willing to use some of those techniques and help you ground during your travel, that's going to result in a biochemical change in your body that's going to combat that fear and fight or flight response that leads to symptoms. The third tool you can use is physiological and other types of stress reduction. So if we think of all the things in your life that are contributing to you feeling stressed out or your brain being in threat mode, which, by the way, are not always the same thing, I like to think of all these things as components in a big bucket, which I call your stress bucket or your stress capacity. When there are a lot of things going into that bucket, it's much more likely to overflow. When you're doing a relatively good job of taking things out of the bucket, then even additional stress from things like travel are much less likely to overspill into this fight-flight threat response. So with a little bit of strategy before you leave, and trying to manage stress in the weeks leading up to your traveling, you can make sure that your stress bucket isn't completely full right before you leave, which also, again, is going to make it less likely that you're going to overspill into that threat mode. So a short list of things that might help include things like getting exercise, meditation, the physiological stress reduction techniques I talk about on my channel, like breathing, like spending time with loved ones or pets, like making sure that maybe you have an extra day between work and leaving for your trip and coming back from your trip and starting to work again, so you have some time to get settled and reoriented before you have to make that transition. Again, be creative here and realistic when it comes to your lifestyle, keeping in mind that any little component that you're able to take out of your stress bucket is going to yield much less of a probability that you're going to end up in that fight or flight mode during travel. Now, a word here about vestibular suppressants. As you guys know from what I talk about extensively here on my channel, I take a psychosocial approach to helping people with chronic dizziness. That said, I don't think it's necessary for anyone to suffer more than you have to. So if you have an extreme fear of traveling and you're still working on this neural circuit dizziness stuff, it is perfectly okay to ask your physician for a small prescription of some kind of anti-anxiety medication that you can take during the actual travel itself. It's going to help bring down that threat mode or fight or flight response, and it also acts as a vestibular suppressant. So many of these medications, like Klonopin, are specifically used to bring down the response of your vestibular system. This can give you some temporary relief and also give you the knowledge that you have something in your back pocket just in case things are really difficult for you. And the result of that knowledge is also a reduction in threat mode, which again leads us to our goal. Now, long term, do I think that this is what I'd like you to do for the rest of your life? No. But this recovery process is a journey. So if you feel like that's where you're at, then talk to your doctor about that. Overall though, with these 3 tools, and particularly the first one, I hope that's eased some of your fears about traveling with your chronic dizziness symptoms. Again, I can't emphasize enough that from my perspective and what I've seen over and over and over again with my one-on-one clients and my community members, people do really well traveling and they surprise themselves almost every time. So go travel, go enjoy yourself, and a lot of times coming back and having those symptoms change as you're moving around, not so bad when you're traveling and then coming back when you get home, is further evidence that what you're dealing with is indeed neural circuit dizziness and that you can recover from it. If you've got questions or comments, guys, please drop them below. If you found this video helpful, please like, share, and subscribe. And as always, thank you so much for tuning in. I'll talk to you guys soon.